So hi and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled Feminist Writings, where we're looking at D.H. Lawrence's short story Tickets Please. We've had already a couple of lectures on this story, and we just move on with the text today. But as I may have mentioned already at the beginning when we started to read the story, the setting of the story is important. The spatio-temporal setting is 1919, right after the First World War. It's Northern England, which has traditionally been the more economically depressed England. So the trams over here become very interesting metaphors of movement, movement between the rural landscape, the colliery landscape, and the urban city. So the trams connect the rural landscapes to the city, and that's something which you need to bear in mind. And also, I may have mentioned this already as well, and that is when you look at the language in the story, especially when it comes to the dialogues, we find that the dialogues are quite crude and unsophisticated in quality, and that's chiefly because the characters in the story are very quote-unquote working-class characters. And so Lawrence is being very realistic. He is giving authentic idiom and authentic language to the characters over here who converse in language which is quite crude and unsophisticated and working-class in quality. And that's something which you have to bear in mind. And so the language, the movements, the diversions, the aspirations of these characters over here belong to a particular cultural register, and that's something that is quite heavily highlighted in the story. So we come to the section today where we have this character Annie, who is one of the tram conductors over here. She goes to this fair, this statutes fair in Middleton, where she encounters this person, John Joseph, the tram inspector, who we've already seen is a bit of a sexual predator in the story. And what happens in this fairground becomes quite important symbolically, and it symbolically suggests a certain kind of relationship, a certain kind of intimacy which is initiated between Annie and John Joseph. But before we move on to the sort of nitty-gritty of what really happens, let's have a little symbolic study of the fairground as a space. So what kind of a space is a fairground? The fairground is a space which is ludic in quality, which is essentially playful in quality. It opens up different kinds of permutations, combinations. It is defamiliarizing in quality. We have things such as wooden horses which you ride, which go round and round in merry-go-rounds. We have doors, we have speaking doors, we have electric lights which dance in certain directions. So we have all kinds of things which are metonymic, defamiliarizing, moving in quality, and so the fairground becomes a bit of a liberating space where you step out of your normal narratives, where you step out of your permitted parameters of behavior, cognition, intimacy, etc. So the fairground can actually be subversive in quality, the fairground can be liberating in quality, and equally the fairground can be unsettling in quality, it can be destructive in quality as well. So the fairground has always been a very important symbol in cinema as well as in literature in terms of entertainment, play, sports, as well as violence, right? So we have lots of very graphic scenes in literature as well as in cinema of violence in a playground, right? So playground is non-domestic, it's unhomely, it's outside the home, and in that sense it becomes a very important spatial metaphor in the story. In this particular story you find how the fairground becomes a trigger for some kind of intimacy between Annie and John Joseph, which was hitherto not there. So we know by now that Annie was careful about John Joseph. She was always on guard or guarded about John Joseph's amorous adventures, amorous advances. But this particular playground experience, this particular playground setting opens up the entire, or decimates or unsettles the guarded quality in the behavior and makes them more vulnerable, makes them accessible from the perspective of John Joseph. Right, so the fairground space is very symbolic in the story, and that's something which you have to bear in mind while reading it carefully. Okay, the Statutes Fair, however, came in November at Middleton, so this should be on the screen now. It happened that Annie had the Monday night off. It was a drizzling, ugly night, yet she dressed herself up and went to the fairground. She was alone, but she expected soon to find a pal of some sort. The roundabouts were veering round and grinding out the music. The sideshows were making as much commotion as possible. In the coconut shies there were no coconuts, but artificial substitutes, which the lads declared were fastened into the irons. So again, look at the metonymic, half-present quality of objects in the fairground. So in the coconut shies there are no coconuts, but artificial substitutes, which are proxying up for the real thing. So there's a degree of unreality, a degree of half reality in the playground, metonymic, half-chopped productions or narratives of meaning. There was a sad decline in brilliance and luxury. Nonetheless, the ground was muddy as ever. There was the same crush, the press of faces lighted up by the flares and the electric lights, the same smell of naphtha and fried potatoes and electricity. So it is a synesthetic sensory quality in this about this playground. It's got the sense of sight, the sense of touch, tactility, the sense of smell, olfactory qualities. All these things come together in terms of making the playground a bit of a stimulating space. It stimulates your senses to the extent that it makes you drop your guard, right? And that happens in the story in terms of the very sexual quality of the relationship which takes place in this playground. So we find that what happens between John Joseph and Annie is a very sort of thinly disguised description of a kind of a sexual intimacy which takes place in the playground through different objects. They ride together to different rides they experience together, and that happens in a very intimate way, in a very sensual way. And that sensuality, that intimacy, suggests to a certain kind of relationship triggering off between the two characters over here, which is never quite spelled out in graphic details, but then we get a sense of that it's happening, that it's moving into a different territory of relationship, a different territory of intimacy. Okay, so Annie finds herself in this playground where it's very sensory, very sentient, and it's opening up different directions in terms of the senses. Who should be the first to greet Miss Annie on the showground but John Joseph? He had a black overcoat buttoned up to his chin and a tweed cap pulled down over his brows. His face between was ruddy and smiling and hearty as ever. She knew so well the way his mouth moved. So again, we look at the very interesting description of the sartorial quality in John Joseph's appearance. The tweed cap, for instance, is very interesting because tweed is normally associated with upper class or gentlemanly garment, gentlemanly costume. So there is a degree of aspiration about the way he dresses up. There's an aspiratory quality or aspirational quality about his sartorial appearance, about his embodied appearance, the way he dresses up in public. John Joseph has got a tweed cap. And of course, we also get to know that Annie knows the movements in her mouth, the movements in his face very well. She can predict the signs. She can tell from the signs on his face, the way he's thinking. So there's a degree of closeness, cognitive closeness already between the two characters, which now becomes quite sexual in quality. She's very glad to have a boy. Again, I mean, look at the seemingly unsophisticated descriptions over here. She's glad to have a boy, a male companion. So this is very working class description, quote unquote working class description, and that's something which belongs to a certain cultural and linguistic register, which Lawrence is obviously tapping. To be at his tattoos without a fellow was no fun. Instantly, like the gallant he was, he took her on the dragon's grim-toothed roundabout switchbacks. It was not nearly so exciting as a tram car, actually, but then to be seated in shaking green dragon, uplifted above the sea of bubble faces, careering in a rickety fashion in the lower heavens, whilst John Joseph leaned over her, his cigarette in his mouth, was after all the right style. She was a plump, quick, alive little creature. She was quite excited and happy. So it gets more and more erotic in quality way, with John Joseph leaning over her with a cigarette in his mouth. And obviously there's a lot of physical intimacy, a lot of physical closeness happening between the two characters. She seems to be excited and happy, and that becomes the erotic overtones quite clearly visible at this point, and it gets more dense gradually. John Joseph made her stay on for the next round, and therefore she could hardly for shame to repulse him when he put his arm round her and drew her a little nearer to him in a very warm and cuddly manner. Besides, he was fairly discreet. He kept his movement as hidden as possible. She looked down and saw that his red, clean hand was out of sight of the crowd, and they knew each other so well, so they warmed up in the fair, warmed up to the fair. So John Joseph seems to be discreetly and very surreptitiously, getting closer to her in terms of the physical proximity, and she doesn't seem to mind at this point. And so the fair warms him up. The fair makes him more, takes him more, makes him take more liberty in terms of physical proximity, in terms of physical intimacy. And interestingly, the fair becomes both a space which is spectacular as well as anonymous. So it is a spectacle, it's a public space, but at the same time, no one quite knows who you are. So you can be as You can take liberties as long as you want, as long as you don't get recognized in the affair. So this combination of spectacular quality and anonymity makes the affair a very interesting space, especially in terms of a relationship like this, which is covertly erotic in quality. After the dragons, they went on the horses. John Joseph paid each time. So again, I mean, look at the way in which the entire gender relationship is very stereotypically mapped out. So John Joseph, the male, is paying for each of these adventures, each of these experiences, whereas she, the female, Annie, is more willing to let him, get more physically close to her, right? So there's a degree of, the stereotypical male behavior of paying and the stereotypical female behavior of allowing the male to come close, that's operative in this point of time in the fairground. So John Joseph paid each time. She could but be complacent. He, of course, sat astride on the outer horse named Black Bess, and she sat sideways towards him on the inner horse named Wildfire. But of course, John Joseph was not going to sit discreetly on Black Bess, holding the brass bar. Round the spun and heaved, so they were in a merry-go-round with his wooden horses. Round the spun and heaved in the light, and round his swung on his wooden steed, the wooden horse, flinging one leg across her mount and perilously tipping up and down across the spade, half lying back, laughing at her. He was perfectly happy. She was afraid that her hat was on one side, but she was excited. So the movements over here, the limb movements over here, the bodily movements over here are very sexual in quality, and that is obviously indicative of the very close, almost sexual quality of the embodiment of the two characters over here in this playground. So again, the playground becomes this spectacular space where liberties are taken, where guards are dropped, where normative behavior, normative godliness, or normative social modes are let down, and then we can have a situation like this where the characters get proximate to each other in a way which is almost dangerous and erotic in quality, especially from the perspective of Annie over here, because we have seen already how Annie has always been guarded towards John Joseph. She's always seen through his advances, and she has known all the time that he's a predator. He preys on young women in terms of establishing temporary sexual relationships with them, and then moves on to other people in a very predator, hunter-like fashion. And this hunter-like quality is something which is interesting, because we find at the end of the story, the hunter will get hunted. It's John Joseph who will get cornered and confined in a room, and all the girls who he had wronged, who he had used for his sexual gratification, will gang up against him quite physically and quite violently. But at this point in time, what we see is Annie is letting her guard down, and then she's getting more excited erotically. And the entire relationship between John Joseph and Annie becomes more graphically and symbolically sexual in quality. He threw coats on a table and won her 2 large pale blue hatpins. And then, hearing the noise of the cinema announcing another performance, they climbed the boats and went in. So this is like local cinema. This is where they put up a film, perhaps, on a big screen for everyone to consume visually in a particular space. So they go and go to that announcement that another film show is about to happen. Of course, during these performances, pitch darkness falls from time to time. When the machine goes wrong, when the projector machine goes wrong, when it stops functioning, everything is pitch dark, because the only light available in the area is from the projector machine, which throws essentially the film on the screen. Then there is a wild whooping and a loud smacking of simulated kisses. And these moments, John Joseph drew Annie towards him. After all, he had a wonderfully warm, cozy way of holding a girl with his arm. He seemed to make such a nice fit. And after all, it was pleasant to be so held, so very comforting and cozy and nice. He leaned over her, and she felt his breath on her hair. She knew he wanted to kiss her on the lips, and after all, he was so warm, and she fitted in so softly. After all, she wanted him to touch her lips. And also, I mean, look at the way in which the phrase "after all" keeps coming, keeps recurring in this passage, which obviously gives a sequential, causal quality in the entire narrative. Now, she really, she doesn't mind being kissed by John Joseph. She doesn't mind being intimate with John Joseph. She doesn't mind getting erotic with John Joseph at this point of time. So the entire setting, the entire ambient quality of the space where creates this atmosphere where she lets herself be drawn to John Joseph, and let herself be desired by John Joseph in a very objective way, right? And that's something which becomes a bit of a climactic quality in the story. That will become the key point in the story from which there will be a sharp turn, as we'll see as we move on with the narrative. But the light sprang up. She also started electrically and put her hat straight. He left his arm lying nonchalant behind her. Well, it was fun, it was exciting to be at the statues with John Joseph. When the cinema was over, they went for a walk across the dark, damp fields. And I think I may have mentioned this already. Taking a walk with John Joseph Oya becomes a euphemism for a lovemaking, euphemism for establishing a sexual relationship with him. So when Annie goes for a walk with John Joseph, what is actually being told to us in a very covert, symbolic, cryptic, coded way is that she perhaps enters into a sexual relationship with him at this point of time. So when the cinema was over, they went for a walk across the dark, damp fields. He had all the arts of lovemaking. He was especially good at holding a girl when he sat with her on a stile in the black and drizzling darkness. He seemed to be holding her in space against his own warmth and gratification, and his kisses were soft and slow and searching. So Annie walked out with John Joseph, again a euphemism for lovemaking, though she kept her own boy dangling in the distance. Some of the tram girls chose to be huffy, but there you must take things to find them in this life. So we are told already that Annie had a boyfriend who she was semi-serious with, but then she keeps him in the distance, dangling in the distance. She doesn't let him go either. But then she walks out with John Joseph in a sense of, perhaps entering or establishing an amorous relationship with him. There was no mistake about it. Annie liked John Joseph a good deal. She felt so pleasant and warm in herself whenever he was near. And John Joseph really liked Annie more than usual. The soft melting way in which she could flow into a fellow as if she melted into his very bones was something rare and gratifying. He fully appreciated this. So again, the descriptions, the metaphors are very sensual in quality. But with a developing acquaintance, there began developing an intimacy. Annie wanted to consider him as a person, a man. She wanted to take intelligent interest in him and to have an intelligent response. She did not want a mere nocturnal presence, which was what he was so far, and she prided herself that he could not leave her. So this is where the sharp turn begins to take place in the story, in the sense that Annie wants John Joseph and herself to be a real relationship, to establish some kind of a human relationship, which is holistic in quality, which is emotional in quality, which is intelligent in quality. So we are told that she wanted to take an intelligent interest in him and move away from just being a nocturnal presence. Sometimes she is more of a nighttime activity for him at this point in time, but she wants to move on from there and become a more full person, in terms of being perhaps his partner, perhaps his companion in real life, not just a nocturnal sexual partner, which is what she is at this point in time. Here she made a mistake. John Joseph intended to remain a nocturnal presence. He had no idea of becoming an all-round individual to her. So John Joseph didn't want to become an all-round individual to her. So for him, from his perspective, this is just a nighttime sexual adventure. This is just a nighttime amorous adventure. And he wanted to keep it that way. He didn't want to move on to the next level of taking an emotional human interest in her. So for John Joseph, Annie did not exist as a person. Annie was just an adventure, a sexual adventure. And that's something which we are told in the story as part of the trait of this particular character, John Joseph. That's something which is a recursive character in him, that he moves on from one woman to another woman and uses them as objects for his own sexual gratification. And that's why the whole crisis in the story takes place. When she started to take an intelligent interest in him and his life and his character, he sheared off. So he completely moved away when the moment he found out that he was, Annie was taking an intelligent interest in him as a person, as a human being. He hated intelligent interest, and he knew that the only way to stop it was to avoid it. The possessive female was aroused in Annie, so he left her. This is the complex emotional quality in a relationship when Annie begins to become possessed about him, when Annie begins to take a human interest in him. And the moment he discerns it, the moment he finds it out that this is becoming more than a sexual relationship, he leaves them, he moves on, he stops seeing her essentially. So this is where the predatory quality of John Joseph becomes important. This is where the entire sense of betrayal, the entire sense of being used as a woman gets foregrounded in the story. So Annie becomes, Annie gets cheated, Annie gets let down, and gets disappointed by John Joseph, who just looks at her as some kind of an objective sexual presence, not a human person at all, not a full human person at all. And that therein lies the betrayal, therein lies the disappointment, therein lies the tragedy, if you will, from Anna's perspective. Because as far as John Joseph is concerned, this is just another game, this is just another adventure for him, which he is keen to move on from the moment it begins to become more than just an adventure. It was no use saying she was not surprised. She was at first startled, thrown out of her account, for she had been so very sure of holding him. So she had always hoped, she had always desired to hold him as a person, to perhaps enter into a companionship with him in an emotional, holistic sense. For a while she was staggered, and everything became uncertain to her. Then she wept with fury, indignation, desolation, and misery. So she gets depressed, she weeps with misery, because she had this idea of a holistic companionship with John Joseph, which obviously he wasn't interested in, being a predator that he is, and he's moved on to someone else for his own sexual gratification. So from his perspective, this is just a sexual adventure, which is something which is deeply humiliating and miserable for her. Then she had a spasm of despair. There's a depression period that she enters. And then when he came, still impudently, onto her car, still familiar, but letting her see by the movement of his eyes that he had gone away to somebody else for the time being and was enjoying past his name, then he didn't mind to have her own back. Right, so this is the point of the story which begins to become psychologically tense in quality, because she decides to avenge herself. She decides to avenge her humiliation on John Joseph, in the sense that she realizes over here that he's moved on to someone else, he's having another perhaps sexual adventure with another person, and is probably just completely forgotten about the relationship that he had with Annie. Right, so that's something that is humiliating for her, and she's determined to have her own back. She just determined to get back at John Joseph. She had a very shrewd idea of what girls John Joseph had taken out. She went to Nora Putty. Nora was a tall, rather pale, but well-built girl with beautiful yellow hair. She was somewhat secretive. Hey, said Annie, accosting her, then softly, who's John Joseph on with now? I don't know, said Nora. Why then does, said Annie, ironically lapsing into dialect. Heather knows as well as I do. And this is a very important section, because what we are saying here is how the linguistic register shifts into the more colloquial, the more topical, the more local quality, the more, perhaps the more dialectical quality, rather than being more grammatically correct. And that shift is interesting because there's a corresponding shift in the emotional register as well, right? So obviously this is getting more confessional, this is getting more personal in quality, this is getting more candid in quality, this kind of conversation. So the colloquial, local, vulgar metaphors or intonations in a dialect becomes a very important symbolic presence on a linguistic level, from a linguistic perspective, right? So Dana, as well as I do, is something that the two girls share with each other, and that has a desired effect on Nora. What I do then, said Nora, it isn't me, so don't bother. It sits in Macon, isn't it? It's for all I know. Hasn't got a face on him, said Annie. I don't half like his cheek. I can knock him off the footboard when it comes round me. He'll get dropped one of these days, said Nora. Aye, he will when somebody makes up the mind to drop it on him. I shall have to see him taken down a peg or two, shouldn't you? I shouldn't mind, said Nora. You've got quite as much cause to do as I have, said Annie, but we'll drop on him one of these days, my girl. What don't you want to do? So what Annie is doing essentially is she's trying to gang up. She's trying to establish some kind of solidarity with other women who have been wronged by John Joseph as well. And in the process, she's trying to set up a consensus in terms of avenging themselves collectively, avenging all the people who have been wronged, who have been used and abused and exploited by John Joseph collectively. So they are probably trying to form a group over here which will now determine how to avenge themselves on John Joseph for being the sexual predator that he is. You've got quite as much cause as I have, said Annie, but we'll drop on him one of these days, Michael. What don't you want to do? I don't mind, said Nora. But as a matter of fact, Nora was much more vindictive than Annie. So there's a lot of vengeance on his characters over here against John Joseph, and that's something which we find constantly in Lawrence's fiction. A lot of psychological tension, vendetta, revenge, all these things get subterraneanly, they become subterranean presence in a psychological situatedness of his characters. Sometimes it becomes homoerotic in quality, sometimes it becomes sadistic in quality. So a lot of psychological violence gets foregrounded in Lawrence's fiction, and this is where this particular story begins to become psychologically violent as well. So one by one, Annie went the round of the old flames. It so happened that Sissy Maiken left the tramway service in quite a short time. Her mother made her leave. So, again, this idea of women coming and joining a service and then getting exploited by John Joseph and then being forced to leave for perhaps biological reason or perhaps social reasons of shame, etc., that becomes a very disturbing depiction of exploitation in the workplace, a very disturbing depiction of harassment and abuse in the workplace. And that's one of the reasons why I may have told us already, this story is very interestingly relatable to some of the things which we are experiencing today in terms of news media, in terms of knowledge that that reveals to us in terms of women getting exploited, harassed in the workplace. So that this particular story by D.H. Lawrence becomes a very interesting literary example of such a situation way before these things crystallize into a movement as we have today. So this is 1919, but then we have this instance of women coming and joining a tram service and then leaving the tram service because of sexual reasons, because of one man who hunts them essentially as a predator, a sexual predator. So her mother, Susie Maiken, who was a woman that John Joseph was in a relationship, in a sexual relationship, was forced to leave by her mother. Then John Joseph was on the qui vive. He cast his eyes over this old flock. So because there's no one knew that he could exploit, there's no one knew that he could establish a relationship, but he came back to his old flock. He came back to his old woman. So again, I mean, the flock metaphor is an animal metaphor here, and many more animal metaphors which will keep coming up in the story at this point of time, especially the hunting metaphors will be interesting to observe from a reader's perspective. So John Joseph returns to his old flock, returns his gaze, as it were, on this old flock, the people who was already exploited. And his eyes lighted on Annie. He thought that she would be safe now, besides he liked her. She arranged to walk home with him on a Saturday night. It so happened that a car would be in the depot at 9:30. The last car would come in at 10:15. So John Joseph was to wait for her there. So this is a situation, this is a place in the story, the spot in the story where John Joseph gets set up, and Annie says, you can come to the depot at 9:30, and last car will be at 10:15. So there'll be a period of time in between where John Joseph was supposed to come and see him, or see Annie. At the depot, the girls had a little waiting room of their own. It was quite rough but cozy, with a fire and an oven and a mirror and a table and wooden chairs. So this is a place where presumably they dressed up and rested after the duties of the day. The half-dozen girls who knew John Joseph only too well had arranged to take service to Sunday afternoon. So as the cars began to come in early, the girls dropped into the waiting room, and instead of hurrying off home, they sat around the fire and had a cup of tea. So again, I mean, look at the domesticity in the setting and how quickly this domesticity will become violent in quality. This domesticity will be defamiliarized into something graphically violent and something viscerally violent, as we'll see in the story. But at this point, we have a perfectly domestic and innocuous setting where the girls are waiting for John Joseph to come in, and they are resting by the fire. It's a very cold night outside, and instead of hurrying back home, they sat around the fire and had a cup of tea. So again, consuming tea at the end of a long day is a very domestic activity in Britain, especially in this kind of weather conditions. So John Joseph came on the car after Annie at about 9:45. So he came in the last tram of the day at 9:45. He poked his head easily into the girls' waiting room. "Prayer meeting?" he asked. "Aye," said Laura Sharp, "ladies' effort." "That's me," said John Joseph. It's one of his favourite exclamations. "Shut the door, boy," said Muriel Bagley. "On which side of me?" said John Joseph. "Which they likes," said Polly Birkin. So all these people, Muriel Bagley, Polly Birkin, Laura Sharp, so these are characters who have been presumably wronged by John Joseph, had been presumably exploited sexually by John Joseph, and now they've ganged up, now they form a collective. And interestingly, when Laura Sharp says ladies' effort, it's sort of supposed to be funny over here in terms of naming a club, but this is exactly what happens subsequently. The ladies' effort, they come together to avenge themselves for the humiliation and sexual abuse at the hands of John Joseph. He had come in and closed the door behind him. The girls moved in the circle to make a place for him near the fire. He took off his greatcoat and pushed back his hat. So he's he's not suspecting at this point in time. He gets in, and he closes the door behind him. The girls move in a circle and make a place for him near the fire. So again, this idea of forming a circle around him becomes very much a part of the hunting narrative, very much part of the hunting metaphor that is being employed by Lawrence in the story. He takes up his great coat and pushed back his hat. Who handles the teapot? He said. Nora silently poured him a cup of tea. So Nora is a person which we are told already that she's more vindictive than Annie. So she and Annie were the ones who brewed this entire idea, and now they're brewing tea and they're handing over a cup of tea to him. Want a bit of my bread and dripping? Said Muriel Bagley to him. All's welcome. And I began to eat his piece of bread. There's no place like home, girls, he said. They all looked at him as he uttered this piece of impudence. He seemed to be sunning himself in the presence of so many damsels, so he's very much at ease. He's enjoying the company of woman, as he always does, and he's having his tea and bread made by the woman, and he's passing on aphorisms to them at this point in time when he's saying, there's no place like home, girls. Especially if you're not afraid to go home in the dark, said Laura Sharp. So, be me, by myself I am. So this whole idea of being afraid to go home in the dark becomes a metaphor of sexual abuse, a metaphor of sexual victimization. So these are all victims in the hands of Joan Joseph, sexual victims. So the language becomes quite coded in quality, quite cryptic in quality at this point in time. And Joan Joseph says that me, by myself I am, so I'm always afraid to go home in the dark, so that's the reason why I take company. And we all know, we've really seen how walking with Joan Joseph in the dark becomes an euphemism in the story for establishing a sexual relationship with him. That's something which we have to keep in mind. They sat till they heard the last tram come in. In a few minutes, Emma Housley entered. Right, so the last tram of the day has come in, and Emma Housley entered, and everyone is complete. The whole gang is complete now, and now Joan Joseph finds himself surrounded by all this women. But of course, he's not suspecting anything at this point in time. Okay. Come on, my old doc, said Polly Birkin. It is perishing, said Emma, holding her fingers to the fire. But I'm afraid to go home in the dark, sang Laura Sharp, the tune having got into her mind. Who are you going with tonight, Mr. Rayner? Asked Muriel Bagley coolly. Tonight, said Joan Joseph. Oh, I'm going home by myself, all my lonely hour. That's me, said Nora Putty, using his own ejaculation. The girls laughed shrilly. Now, you find that how the violence begins to brew at this point in time, and it begins to brew by using a language used by Joan Joseph against him. So when the girls first asked who is going home with tonight, he had said, I'm going home by myself tonight. And then that same language, the same phrase, that's me, which Joan Joseph had used before, is now used by Nora Purdy to make him uncomfortable. And that's the beginning of the violence over here. And the violence begins with the linguistic appropriation. So we have a sense of appropriating the predator's role over here. So far, Joan Joseph had been the hunter. So far, Joan Joseph had been the predator. But now the roles are reversing gradually. The girls are circling him, and he's sort of in a corner way, in a locked room with all the girls around him. And they are beginning to become the hunters over here, and that's indicated with the use of his phrases on him. Right, that's me, said Nora Purdy, using his own ejaculation. The girls laughed shrilly. Okay, so I'll stop at this point today, but what we find from this point as we move on in the next lecture, we find that how Lawrence is such a master of the craft of writing, because he uses language in such a coded quality in order to bring home the point of violence over here, bring home the point of the hunting narrative over here, which gets turned on its head, with all the girls gang up, all the girls who have been wronged by Joan Joseph, who have been abused by Joan Joseph, now confine him to this room and avenge themselves, avenge the humiliation, avenge the sexual abuse on him. And this begins by using his language on him. So that appropriation becomes important. They appropriate the hunter function from Joan Joseph, but before that, they appropriate the language, they appropriate the linguistic expressions that he uses before appropriating his activity, before appropriating his function. Right, so we stop at this point today. We'll continue with this and hopefully finish this story in the next lecture. Thank you for your attention.